All right, so good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our next edition of the WinMagic's Speed Webinar Series. My name is Graham, and I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. I really am looking forward to some thought-provoking discussion on the importance of the endpoint of cybersecurity, but before we do that, let's go through a couple logistics before we begin. Okay, so the first of that being, please drop any questions you may have into the Q&A box below. We'll do our best to get to them at the end of today's presentation during your specified Q&A session. But if they are answered, a WinMagic rep will reach out to you directly to answer those questions. We would like to remind you that the webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be shared in our post-webinar thank you emails. Finally, I encourage you all to fill out the survey at the end of the presentation so that we can continue to use your feedback to continue to deliver quality, relevant content going forward. With that, let's take a moment to introduce you to today's panelists. We have three lucky gentlemen joining us today. I can't wait to hear their insights. In no particular order, we have Gary McCracken first on the list. He's our CISO and VP of Technology here at WinMagic. Next up in the middle on screen, we have Thi Nguyen Hu. He's our CEO and founder of WinMagic. I'm really grateful to hear what he has to say for us today. And finally, we have Lloyd Grimes, our customer success manager here and the voice of the customer on our team. With that said, today we're going to be focusing on the important role of the endpoint within an organization's cybersecurity environment. We'll start by discussing a stance on security that begins with protecting the endpoint itself rather than responding to threats in a reactive manner. From there, we'll look at some of the unique security benefits of the endpoint and how organizations can leverage such aspects for their benefit. Okay, so with that, let's get into our panel discussion. Gary, it looks like the first question I have is probably best suited for you. Why don't we start with a look at NIST's framework for cybersecurity?
Thanks, Graham. Okay, as you know, anybody who's listened to one of these webinars before, that I'm a big fan of NIST. So NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States. So we had a look at the NIST framework for cybersecurity, and it has 5 pillars. The 5 pillars are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And the basic idea is that if you have a security program in place that covers these 5 pillars, you'll have a successful and holistic security program. Okay, we don't have time to go through all the 5 pillars today, but today's premise is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And to give sort of a real world example of that, COVID could be considered a prevention. And being in the hospital ICU, COVID vaccine is prevention. And being in the hospital ICU with COVID would be a recovery type thing. And the idea again here is that it's much easier and cheaper and better to prevent COVID or a cybersecurity incident than it is to recover from it or to cure it. So focusing a little bit more in onto the protect pillar or the prevent pillar, it has a number of different sort of aspects, but the whole idea is to limit or contain the impact of a cybersecurity incident. And there's a number of things that fall from that. One is identity management and access control. And a very good example of a preventative technology for that is multifactor authentication, MFA. Mm-hmm. There are other ones. There's something they call managing protective technology. And that examples of that could be maybe multi or full disk encryption. And they're not all technical. There's awareness and training because employees and people are often a great way to protect and prevent things, and you can do that by arming them with security awareness training. Mm-hmm. One of the other things that I like about NIST, and I can see throughout NIST, is a thread where when we're talking about prevention or protecting, that cryptography is something that arises multiple times. Certainly, it's sort of obvious that if you're doing full disk encryption, that you're using cryptography there. But for multi-factor authentication, it's interesting that NIST actually requires cryptography or cryptographic methods to get to the highest level of assurance. So again, we're talking today a little bit about preventing, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how we leverage the endpoint in protection. And cryptography is a very good technology for prevention.
Okay.
Sort of sets the stage, Graham.
Yeah, no, thank you. That lines it up perfectly. Awesome. Okay. So before we take a second to go any further, I just want to give a little bit of a note for the audience. For the purposes of today's webinar, we'll be referring to devices used by employees to conduct their regular work activities, including laptops, desktops, and phones, for example. Those are all as endpoints. That's what we're really going to be referring to, just to give some context for you guys. Okay. Now, with that said, most experts see full disk encryption as a key solution to protecting the endpoint and the data that resides within it. Lloyd, can you maybe give us a little bit of a background on FDE, maybe explain what full disk encryption is for those of us that aren't currently aware, and go through some of the benefits of its use?
Certainly. So full disk encryption, as probably some of you know, is a cryptographic method that applies to encryption of the entire hard drive, whether it includes the data, the files, the operating system, and software programs. To give I guess a comparable example would be to lock all the exterior entrances to your home. So locking your windows, your doors. What that helps to prevent is any outside intruders getting to your internal space. And similarly, encryption, full disk encryption, prevents outsiders from actually invading that space and being able to get contents that are within your disk drive.
So it's all about protecting the endpoint as a whole, right? Okay, awesome. Well, I think that knowing this background on FTE, let's get into addressing our title. T, what critical role does the endpoint have in cybersecurity?
Good day, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar. Yes, critical role of the endpoint in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is something online. Endpoint is not really online. So where is the relationship? Is it not obvious? So we spend some time to look at the cybersecurity and the various components, and we study, investigate how the endpoint do something versus other components. What Gary mentioned a little bit before is actually we believe under endpoint versus servers. Versus doesn't mean that there is a fight and there's a winner or loser. It's rather we look at the endpoint and the server and see, okay, from their functionality, from where they are, who can do a better job in doing some job, for cybersecurity. And so we get into some comparison of some idea about endpoint versus everything else. And I want to bring up versus something which is, I think, very interesting. Let's say that is endpoint versus you, the human, the user. Okay, so endpoint versus you. I think it's very interesting because it's big. Let's look at the use case to see how big it is. Okay? Let's talk about something relevant, probably to all of you. Okay? How many of you are concerned that some attacker, probably somewhere in a foreign country, trying to attack your online resources? Probably most of you, probably all of you, right? And so if we can change it, we can make it better, it would be relevant for you. So if you can set the requirement that only your laptops can access your resource online, it means if the attacker wants to attack you, they have to go and steal your laptop first. So how many attacker would do that? Would that condition reduce the amount of attack you receive to, I don't know, 99, reduced to 1% of what you have today? I mean, it's big, right? So look at that, our remote authentication, and see how endpoint versus you can contribute to it. So remote authentication is about you proven, or the endpoint proven to the server that you have something nobody else have, or you know something nobody else know. So it's cybersecurity, so it's online, it's remote. So everything become data. Even if you see something on the website, even though whatever you see, it's all data. It's just, you cannot show what you have or what you are anymore. So everything is data. So it's more about what you know. Yeah? And so until now, the industry say the computer cannot differentiate themselves. So the only one I can use to show that something you know and nobody else know is you with your password. Yeah? And we know how good the password is, with the requirement that nobody would know that. So it's very difficult for you to remember them and make sure nobody knows that. But for the endpoint today have all the power so that they can have a response to a challenge no other computer in the world can have. So the endpoint can perfectly do the remote authentication 1,000 times, billion times better than human do. So it's time to let the endpoint do that work. And so the other consideration with the password is that you may have lost the password, meaning somebody knows it and you don't know it. With the endpoint, it's completely different. If you lose your endpoint, you would know that. You will tell your IT department, and they will, configure not to trust that endpoint anymore. And if you're late a little bit of day and so on, it doesn't matter. I mean, the malware and so normally stay there for months and years. So a little bit of late doesn't matter. And also we think that the endpoint should be protected. So it's difficult for the attacker to even go bypass your full disencryption and Windows logon as well. So I think, that solution is very, very good.
For sure. Okay.
So we promote that you should use the endpoint as a primary factor because the endpoint can do things nobody else can do. The entire computer in the world would take years, thousands of years to attack your endpoint. And one last point I want to mention is, when it's online, everything becomes data. The best technology to bring trust into the data is cryptography. So Gary mentioned it. You should remember it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, T. I definitely think that really lined up some interesting pieces. Suggesting device authentication instead of user authentication is a very bold move, but it's new and it sounds like it could possibly change some of the computing landscape. Are you sure that this is the right direction to continue going forward?
Yeah, I want to clarify that I'm not saying remove the user factor out of authentication. So you still have to keep it. It just mainly the main factor is the endpoint. Okay? Concretely, the TPM on the endpoint can represent the endpoint itself. So nobody can have that key in the TPM. But the TPM also have the capability to say, I only have that key if the user enter a password. So it can have two keys. One key represent the endpoint and one key represent the user and the endpoint. And so you can have, several user authentication, and it includes the endpoint and the user. Okay, but there is another reason why endpoint is more important than others, because today, do you know how often you log in your email server? Probably you do it maybe a day, maybe once a day, maybe once a month. Okay, but every time the server sends you email, they authenticate the endpoint somewhat. Meaning this authentication, this device authentication is very important, even though today people don't do it. So by putting the endpoint authentication actively on the endpoint, it can substantially make everything more secure. I mean, even to the effect that the SolarWinds MFA bypass would not succeed anymore if you can have this kind of active cookie into the endpoint. So we propose using the endpoint as a primary factor and user secondary, not removing the user.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. I think that brings us well into our next segment here. So let's keep going, and we've got looks like we have a poll coming up next. Alrighty. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So with this poll, we're going to be launching the first question. Lost my mouse. Okay, so let's launch the poll. What does security start with? We're going to give you guys about 20 seconds, 30 seconds to answer. Okay, good, nice little spread here. Okay. All righty. Okay, so it looks like we've pretty much had the majority of you guys respond. That's great. Over 80% of you participated. So we're going to end the poll. Okay, and let's go ahead and share some of the results for you guys on screen. As you can see, we had a nice mix across the board, with the security starting with the endpoint being the #1 answer, followed by user, the data itself, and then the network. Okay, so I think this sets the ground pretty well for the next point that we want to talk about. And Gary, maybe let's look at leveraging the endpoint as a factor of authentication to protect the network.
Thanks, Ram. So this sort of dovetails or delves further into some of the points that he has already made. So the endpoint, the laptop or perhaps the phone that you're actually connecting into the network to actually do the work on, is your jumping off point into the network. So first of all, as Lloyd says, we have to protect that device. So it should have antivirus, it should have full disk encryption, and so forth. But then once you start connecting into the network, that's when it starts to become really scary. And up until, well, still maybe even today, the password has been the primary method for authenticating into the network. Now, and it's the biggest problem too. If you probably already know this, but passwords have to be, or could be, a complex letter, string of letters, numbers, symbols. It becomes difficult to type all those things in on a keyboard. Certainly difficult to remember them. Even more difficult to remember them if you have to change them every 90 days and you've got a decade of old passwords floating around in your head about which one to use. And those passwords are shared secrets. So some form of them is on the server side. And if they're on the server side, you can be leaked en masse with a server breach. Or they can be phished. The user can be tricked into typing in their password into the attacker's web browser, and then they can use that to attack it from potentially anywhere in the world. And if you forget it, or the server expires it on you, then you have to go through time-consuming password reset procedures. So passwords are, very clearly a very big problem, and the solution is multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is some combination, or at least two of the following three things: something you know, something you have, or something you are. The idea here, now we're talking about leveraging the endpoint. The idea here is to turn your endpoint, whether it be a laptop or the phone, into the something you have factor of MFA. An example of how we could do that is most laptops, almost all business laptops and most consumer laptops, all have a chip in them. It's called a Trusted Platform Module, a TPM. It's a mini HSM, hardware security module, really, that can do cryptographic operations, as well as store cryptographic keys. And that TPM can be used to turn the device, your laptop, into a cryptographic token to do that asymmetric cryptography, the kind that NIST says you have to be at the highest level of assurance. And now you end up with your laptop or potentially your phone as your token. And there's some very good reasons we're going to get into later on why that endpoint, it has capabilities and functions that you can't get other places. Well, I guess I'll leave it at that for now, Graham. And
yeah, no, thanks, Gary. I think that's the perfect point to leave it, because right next we've got our next poll. Okay, so while I will keep this on screen, let's launch the poll. Poll number 2. Okay, so what is your preferred device for multi-factor authentication? I think this is going to be interesting based off of the section that we just discussed. Once again, we'll give you guys about 30 seconds to answer. Okay, so my answers are still trickling in here. Okay, 70. I'll wait till we get about the 80%. Okay. All right, so we're going to go ahead and end the poll and then share the results. Okay, as we can see, we definitely have an overwhelming majority prefers a mobile authentication app. This is again to be expected. Do we have any response to this answer a little bit? Anyone on the panel?
Oh, maybe a number is going to respond. I'll respond.
Yeah.
So there are many different use cases and environments for business and enterprises. Some of those enterprises, some of those employees primarily work on the laptop, have a company laptop, and do their work on their laptop and access the network from the laptop. And in some of those enterprises, the corporation doesn't give phones to their employees so that they can have that authenticator running. And in some enterprises, employees don't want to have to be told to put authenticator or company apps on their personal phones. And for certainly that significant slice of use case, using the laptop as the authentication device, that's something you have, I think has a big advantage. Not everybody agrees, but I think there is certainly a use case there.
Okay, definitely. Thanks for taking the time to go ahead and give a little bit of a rebuttal and reply there. Okay, so with that being said, the endpoint's role, I think we've really, the endpoint's role, it seems critical and can perform many things better than any other component. For example, servers or users that T mentioned earlier. T, don't tell me you have another story about the endpoint versus something, do you?
I think we talk a bunch, okay? And normally I may not see it as another thing, but I was a bit surprised to see the poll with the phone, the mobile app as being the most favorable solution. Okay, so I want to now address endpoint versus the phone. Okay, look at that, the school. The sexy phone, how does the not so sexy endpoint compete with the sexy phone? So, because I think the idea is if you have the endpoint, you don't need anything else. Why do you need the phone? The endpoint, phone is whatever it is, it's an extra hardware you have to take off. Okay. In any case, so if you want to have a portable solution, let's say you have several laptops and so on, and so then maybe you prefer to have something portable like a phone or a USB device to carry around. And so in this case, a portable device like USB and the phone who is attached to the endpoint is considered for us is the endpoint. So we offer the solution together with or without phone based on the endpoint. Okay? But there are also another solution where the phone is the out-of-band device, and that is become more and more popular. But we don't believe that is the best solution because of the non-association between the phone and the endpoint. So the phone could be half the earth apart from the endpoint. And so where is the association? Where is the session binding? Okay? So we believe that, we like the phone, we offer the phone together with endpoint or even outside of endpoint because of some use cases where, the identity provider have to talk to the phone directly and so on. So there's all kind of new things, but we believe that in the kind of versus endpoint versus the phone, the endpoint wins because it's better in terms of natural solution. Okay, we believe that within the next few years, the industry will solve two problems better so that the phone can be used better with the endpoint. Stay tuned. I'm excited to see the development.
All righty, thanks, T. I think that really does clarify, and thank you for bringing that that phone versus the endpoint into the discussion because I think it is extremely relevant. Okay, so Gary, T just covered the endpoint's role in protecting authentication, but is there anything else important about the endpoint itself that can contribute to secure authentication?
Sure. I'm going to call them contextual signals, which will require some explanation. But the endpoint, the device that you're actually doing the work on, it's the device that knows the environment that the user is accessing the network in. And it's, for instance, can be a source of these signals to the relying party or the IDP, which can allow it to make a better decision, an intelligent decision, whether or not to authenticate the user, or even with continuous authentication, to allow them to continue to access the resources. So some examples of contextual signals that have to come from the endpoint are things like, well, what operating system is running, and is it up to date? Is it patched? Is antivirus running? Is it up to date? Is there a phone in proximity, via Bluetooth to that laptop? Or another one, of course, is a full disk encryption? Is the endpoint being full disk encrypted? We'll give you a bit of an example of that one, a more of a historical one of the context for the environment. Is many years ago, before the ubiquitous internet, one of our customers had life insurance agents. They go into people's homes and they would collect personal information in an app. But before they could allow that data to be saved to the computer, it would do an API call to check and make sure that full disk encryption was completely implemented. That way, you couldn't save data to an unencrypted drive. That kind of idea can be extended or leveraged from the endpoint into the network, where that you will only be able to allowed to do certain things, or maybe nothing at all, based on the health and the stance of your endpoint. And so I think the key point here is that only the authentication software that's running on the endpoint can understand the full context of the user and provide those signals or context to the relying party or the IDP to make that intelligent decision. Mm-hmm. If it's a USB security key, or what we've been talking about, these out-of-band authenticators, they could be half a world away. They don't really know what's going on that endpoint, what the user is using to authenticate originally or on an ongoing basis.
Okay. All right. Thanks for taking the time to illustrate that for us. I think, no, it's a very relevant point. So thanks, Gary. Before I move on to our final two segments of the webinar, I just wanted to take the time to highlight a couple key points and reiterate them for you guys, the audience members. So first, we have protection and prevention and how it outperforms a more reactive approach to security. This comes back to our statement from the beginning. 1 ounce of prevention is worth a pound of a cure. And I think that we've illustrated that today for you guys. Next, I want to reiterate that security starts at the endpoint. This premise is simple: stop attacks before they can occur and move on to bigger, more headline-worthy attacks like ransomware that we see all in the news these days. Focusing on cryptography is the strongest basis for protection and prevention. So that's another point that I want to highlight, and this is a key detail. Cryptography. Keep an eye out for it when you're assessing any specific vendor or solution with regards to endpoint security. Okay, it's simple, really. If you want to secure your organization's IT environment, prevent attacks from ever occurring through cryptography and authentication, and partner with full disk encryption to protect the data and the endpoint itself. Okay, with that, let's pivot over to our Q&A for today's presentation.
Okay, I can answer one question.
Yep, we've definitely had some questions come in. Do you want me to read that one out before you go ahead, T?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this question's coming in from Glenn. If the endpoint has been compromised with persistent presence per ransomware, would the malware not have access to the data if the legitimate user has plugged in a USB key?
Okay, so the answer is, if the malware has complete control, then there's nothing you can do about it. But normally the answer, the malware cannot have complete control. So the idea about authentication, including specified by FIDO as well, is that you need user presence. So the user need to press something which the malware cannot do. Mm-hmm. So we spend a lot of time to make sure, for example, if you press a button, it cannot be done by the malware. So the user must be sitting at the device and sitting and press the button or do the biometrics. So you cannot do it from the malware. So we painstakingly things so that the malware cannot do that. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. All right. So we're approaching the half an hour mark at this point, but we have had a few extra questions come in. So let's see if we can try and answer these a little bit relatively quickly. One of the ones that I have come in, it's relating back to the phone, Is using the phone with an app like Microsoft Authenticator, so I guess standard authentication app, the only way to use your phone as a factor of authentication? Is that the only way?
Well, we'll take a crack at this one. So there's two ways to, at least two ways to use the phone. One is that Microsoft Authenticator running on your phone in an out of band mode. That's where it's sort of disconnected from the endpoint.
Mhm.
The other way is running some kind of a authenticator or token software on the phone and being an extension of the endpoint. So in that case, it would connect, say, through Bluetooth, for example, from the phone to your endpoint, and it could become that authentication token. I guess our contention is that the latter one, if I get latter right, the one where it's Bluetooth connected, is much more secure because it's running in the context of the endpoint as opposed to the disconnected out of band authenticator that could be running anywhere and subject to push attacks and so forth.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Gary. I think that brings us, we're already 2 minutes over, so I'm just going to try and wrap this up nice and quick. Okay, so thank you guys for sending those questions in. There really were some great questions. I noticed that we didn't have a chance to get to all of them. So as we approach the conclusion for today's panel discussion, I just want to thank everybody again for attending. And a WinMagic rep will be reaching out to you if your question has not been answered. We look forward to seeing you at the next edition of the Speed Webinar series. And please follow the contact information on screen if you want to learn more about our WinMagic as a whole, or specifically our SecureDoc passwordless authentication solution. One of our reps would be more than happy to answer any of the questions you may have. Until next time, these are your WinMagic encryption and authentication experts signing off.